Welcome to Mastering the Grant Lifecycle from Prospect to Execution. Thank you so much for being here. This is the first video in a 5-part webinar series designed to really help your organization strengthen its grant management practices. A little bit about me. I'm Katie Odom. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a former fundraising staff member at River Network and have a background in fundraising, development operations, and managing complex grants and developing grant management systems and strategies. And I found a niche for myself, really working with organizations to help them optimize their grant management, implementing strategies and tools really similar to the ones that we'll be reviewing today. I should mention this webinar complements a really fantastic webinar on collaborative fundraising. It was held last year, and I'll provide a link to that below. So if you're interested in or involved in collaborative fundraising, I really highly recommend checking that out. And finally, a big thank you to River Network for hosting this webinar and to the Water Foundation and Urban Waters Learning Network, whose generous support has made this webinar series possible. So with that said, let's get started. So to kick us off, I want to just put a few scenarios in front of you to see which of these may feel familiar to you. I'll give you a few moments to read, or please pause the video. So I could personally answer yes to every one of these. If you did too, you are not alone. So for many nonprofits, grants are our backbone. They're the backbone of our funding. But managing them often feels stressful, it feels reactive, it feels disorganized, it can strain our collaborative working dynamics with colleagues. I think most of us crave more structure, more seamless collaboration, and feel like we know we could be doing this better, we just don't know where to start. And River Network has heard this again and again from organizations across the network and wanted to respond to that call with this series. So about this series, it's really designed to provide what I think of as a playbook for grant management, a collection of processes, tools, and structure intended to make grant management more efficient and more effective. And our intention is you'll walk away from this webinar with a clear, streamlined grant management process, roles so everyone knows their part, better collaboration norms, tips and guidance, and ready-to-use tools. And this last one's a really central component of this training. We wanted to share tools with you so you can not wonder how to apply and interpret these learnings for your organization, but to really pick up and utilize the structure, the processes, the learnings here that are represented in those tools and pick them up and implement them in your organization. So the outline of this series, it's a series of 5 short videos, all less than 13 minutes. I think this one should be the longest. They start with the 3 pillars of grant management, which we'll get into in the next slide following this one. And then in our second video, we'll cover prospecting, the third, proposal development, the fourth, budget development, and the fifth, grant execution. So let's start and jump in with the 3 pillars of grant management that provide a nice foundation for the rest of these learnings. So the first pillar is the grant management process. With the nature of grants, they're complex. They involve multiple people across multiple teams. They have immovable deadlines. Having a unified, standardized process, the steps which are followed nearly all the time across nearly all grants is a really important foundation to build upon. And I say nearly because, as with all unified processes, there are always exceptions. And so, for example, if you're taking on a renewal grant, you would not start all the way at the beginning of this process, which includes considering new prospects. You'll just jump right into proposal development. So this process flow outlines the 3 main stages of grant management, and we'll cover each stage in depth in the coming videos. As you hopefully saw in that series outline, it follows this flow. But for now, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of the process. So it starts with prospecting, and that's the stage in which we're looking for funding opportunities. So we are identifying prospects or funding opportunities. We are researching and assessing those, and we are deciding to go forward with that opportunity or not. So after we've decided to move forward with a funding opportunity, we move on to the proposal development stage to apply for that opportunity. And that starts with preparing to develop the proposal, launching the proposal, so convening with the team to really move forward in the planning process and develop the proposal, which also includes the budget. So if our proposal is successful and we get a grant, that begins the grant execution phase, which covers everything post-award and includes, reviewing and signing the grant agreement, setting up the grant, launching the grant, and closing the grant. And obviously, there's a lot that happens in between here, and we'll talk about that. So even if your organization uses different terms for these steps or has different steps, hopefully the core elements of this feel recognizable and feel like a process that you've undergone before your organization. Now let's dive into the second pillar, which is collaboration. So, as I mentioned, grants management is an inherently cross-functional process. It impacts and calls upon every team and often nearly every person in an organization. I think it's probably the most collaborative thing that we do in nonprofits day to day. And if you can take a moment and think about a proposal process that went really well, chances are strong collaboration really made the difference in that. So with that said, who is really front and center in these collaborations and these working teams? In my experience, and according to best practice, there are 3 teams that should be consistently engaged in every stage of grant management, and that's finance, programs, and fundraising. You may also have other roles engaged, but I often think of those as really the core team. And second, I have consistency here again for a reason. I think most of the pitfalls that we experience in grant management is when a key person is engaged inconsistently or too far down the line. And I'm sure it's easy for you to call upon an example from your past of where you brought in or you brought in somebody or you were brought in too late by a colleague and it caused challenges or frustration or caused some scrambling. So how do we make that collaboration happen? Of course, there's ongoing communication like emails, chats, conversations across your desk. That's all super vital to pushing work forward. There's also regular structured meetings, and those are really important for a few reasons. They keep those stakeholders I mentioned in the loop regularly. They reinforce that collaborative decision making, and they provide a pause at the beginning of a process. So about that pause, there's a tendency to be really deadline driven, to put your head down and just go it alone, or with a colleague who's on our team. But when we do that, we often make mistakes and overlook things. We don't pull people in at the right time. And we find it really important to gather at these key points at the start of processes. And with that in mind, we recommend 3 meetings through this process, and I'll be going over those as we move forward in our subsequent videos. The third pillar of grant management is roles. So being clear about who is engaged and how, who's leading, how the whole team comes together is so important when you're pursuing and managing grants. A key way to do that, or a few key ways to do that, and this is something that you do with every grant and every proposal that goes through your organization, include designating a grant lead. So you want to assign a clear person in charge. They are coordinating the team, they're tracking deadlines, they're overseeing and implementing the whole grant management process. It is often the same person through that whole process we just saw, but you may change grant leads for different phases, and that's fine. They're also often funder facing, coordinating with the funder throughout each stage of the process. Second is assigning roles and assembling your grant team. So you want to identify roles in the grant team and the individuals who will fill them. Some standard roles for a grant team include grant lead, grant writer, fundraising, finance, and programs rep. And finally, you want to define responsibilities. So setting expectations for tasks, deadlines, and accountability for each role. And that's on a grant by grant basis, but I would recommend a few frameworks that are out there like RACI, MOCA, or role descriptions that can really help provide clarity for your organization, for your team around what the standard expectations would be of each of those roles. I've used all of those and really have found, depending on the organization, them to provide a lot of clarity. Just depends on the kind of how robust you might want that to look. One of my favorite tools and one that I'll share when we get to that template is just a bullet pointed role description that states the different expectations and different responsibilities for each of those roles. So we'll get into that when we get to that template. So that concludes our intro to the series and a quick overview of grant management. We've covered the grant management process, collaboration, and roles. And next, we're going to jump into the first phase of the grant management process, which is prospecting. We'll go over tips and guidance, as well as some tools, and actually take a look at some of those. So thank you for joining and hope to see you in the next video.